I was in a truly awkward position and yet felt no inclination to return to the stage I had just left. I stopped to give a moment's rest to our horses, and my gendarme and servant might prepare their arms. I likewise got mine in readiness. The postilion who accompanied me and to whom I had given a double Napoleon had the appearance of being a very worthy fellow. We were four, and my servant assured me that the band consisted of at least 12 or 15 armed men. This was out of all proportion, but we had no other resource left than to force our way through. I started, therefore, with the determination, and after a quarter of an hour's gentle gallop, I was the first to perceive the band. One man of the party was watching by the roadside on the top of a small rising ground, and the remainder were lying in ambush behind him on a declivity of the hill. It was night. I ordered my attendants to hold their pistols ready, and as soon as I saw the scout of the band running off to give his comrades the alarm, I started off at a full gallop, and arrived before him in the midst of these rascals, upon whom we instantly fired. They immediately took to their heels without noticing that we were only 4 in number. Thus I reached Vittoria, where my carriage overtook me. I there got the start of the information given of my journey, and reached Bayonne without incurring any further danger. The emperor had left Bayonne shortly after King Joseph's departure, and availed himself of the circumstance of his journey to the south to visit the departments which were as yet unknown to him. He proceeded by way of Pau, Toulouse, and Montauban, and on that occasion created a new department, that of the Tarn and Garonne, of which Montauban is its chief town, thus owing its regeneration to his solicitude for its interests. During his stay at Toulouse, he recollected the opposition raised against a plan of works contemplated to be carried into effect on a bridge of the canal of Languedoc, and actually executed, notwithstanding the resistance offered in the Council of State. The success of which undertaking had redounded to the honor of the originator of the plan. Those works had made it necessary to construct a canal bridge over a river. The emperor was desirous of personally inspecting the works and of rewarding the author of them on the very theater of his glory. He sent orders to the prefect as well as to the chief engineer of high roads, who was generally considered to be the author of the plan and superintendent of the work, to repair to the spot where the bridge was erected. The emperor himself, who was never after his time, arrived before the prefect and only found the chief engineer at the place. He was pleased at this circumstance, as it enabled him personally to convey to him the expression of his friendly sentiments. He opened the conversation with this engineer on topics connected with his profession, and closely questioned him upon every point of difficulty which he must have encountered in the execution of such splendid works. The engineer replied with evident embarrassment, and the more the emperor told him to be quite at his ease, the greater was his agitation, which increased so far at last as to place him under the necessity of seeking some excuse to withdraw for a few moments. The emperor said in the meanwhile to those who accompanied him, "I am not correctly informed. The bridge was not made by that man. Such a work is far beyond his capacity." He was dilating upon the subject when the prefect, Mr. Trouvé, I believe, came up. The emperor insisted upon hearing the truth from him, as he had come for that express purpose. The prefect acknowledged, in fact, that the chief engineer was neither the originator of the plan nor the author of the works, both which belonged of right to a common engineer of the department. The emperor immediately sent for this engineer and asked him every question upon which he was desirous of receiving information, adding occasionally during the conversation, "I am quite pleased at having come in person to inspect these splendid works. Otherwise, I should never have known that you were the author of them, and you would have been deprived of the reward to which you are so justly entitled." He then desired that he should follow him to Toulouse, wrote immediately a severe letter of reproach to the Minister of the Interior, appointed this common engineer, the author of the works, to the situation of chief engineer, and made him proceed to the capital. The emperor returned by way of Rochefort, Nantes, Saumur, and Tours, where I overtook him. As he arrived there in the night time, I could only converse with him on the following morning. I was led to believe from the representations made to me that he would give me a cool reception. But had he even struck me, I was fully bent upon exhibiting the aspect of affairs in its true colors. I was no stranger to the emperor's private feelings. He felt as keenly as anyone else the effect of unfavorable news, but he had an utter aversion to falsehood, and it was not until all those who were about his person had acquired a wretched aptitude to servile adulation, it was not, I repeat, until then that his most faithful adherents found it dangerous to persist in an austere observation of truth in their reports upon subjects which he had committed to their care. Those courtiers, those perfidious flatterers, had succeeded in raising so effectual a barrier between the emperor and those who never disguised the truth from him, that he has been kept in utter ignorance of circumstances connected with the most painful difficulties in which he has occasionally been involved. It was nothing new for me to despise the opinion of courtiers and to rely upon the emperor's justice. There was besides no question now of matters of a personal nature, and at the risk of my being sacrificed, I was determined he should know the truth. I should add that he possessed so much penetration, so correct a sense of justice, so strong an attachment to those in whom he really confided, that there was not only perfect safety, but every advantage to be expected from revealing to him the naked facts. Though he might at times be angry with those of his friends who spoke to him without disguise, he invariably returned to them with increased esteem and confidence. We accordingly conversed at great length, and I clearly saw how deeply he felt interested in the accounts I brought to him. He made me repeat my words at every moment and was quite at a loss to understand what had occurred in Andalusia. He was displeased with me for sending so many troops to that province, but I replied that my intention was certainly not to injure his cause. No other news, however bad, could affect him so much as the disasters in the south of Spain, for his eyes were open to the consequences that might result from them. What particularly increased his spleen against the general officers who had signed the capitulation was the clause for searching the soldiers' knapsacks. "I should have preferred being informed of their death," he said, "than that they had been disgraced without fighting. This is inconceivable, and I can only account to myself for such consummate cowardice by ascribing it to the fear of risking the safety of what had been plundered. Nothing worse, in short, could have happened to us. It now becomes a case of the highest importance. You had better proceed to Paris, and we shall talk these matters over at a future opportunity." All the post horses were taken up for his service. Nevertheless, I managed so well that I reached Paris as soon as he did. He had already told Marshal Duroc to send for me, and again called for the most minute details of past occurrences. He inquired into everything, and could not understand that a corps so numerous as that under the orders of General Dupont, which ought to have compelled the troops to Castanes to surrender, should have been captured by the latter without having had any engagement of sufficient importance to subject him to the loss of a single gun. In the course of the inquiry which he instituted upon the subject, he learned the folly of the officer who had gone in quest of Castanes at Andujar to bring him up to Bayonne, and who subsequently wrote to that general to send for the 2 battalions that were stationed at the puerto of the Sierra Morena. The emperor shrugged up his shoulders in sheer pity at such conduct, making a sign of the cross at the same time, which was a sure indication of the contempt he felt for anyone. Let us rather suppose, he said, that this was an act of pure stupidity. Otherwise, no punishment would be too severe for his deserts. But as I will not permit any cowards to be about my person, I have directed that he should be required to tender his resignation. A calm consideration of the unfortunate influence which the capitulation of Bayonne has had upon the insurrection in Spain cannot but be productive of sincere regret, but nothing can check the feeling of indignation which is experienced at reflecting on the causes of that event. What shadow of sincerity can there be in the reproach of the emperors having dealt too severe a punishment to the generals who, on the one hand, fixed the stigma of dishonor upon their own troops, and on the other hand, risked the success of the greatest enterprise ever undertaken? The only fault of the emperor was his not punishing them sooner and with much greater rigor. The severity laid to his charge was a pure act of clemency, and each of them, without exception, would a 12-month before have sentenced to death any one of his brother officers who might have been brought before him under circumstances of a similar nature. He issued a variety of orders on the subject to which I have been alluding. One of the difficulties, however, of the emperor's situation was that in adopting the work of the revolution, he had likewise adopted the men which that revolution had formed. None but the inferior ranks had been filled up by men of a more recent stamp. The others, who had gone together through the several revolutionary periods, had friends and enemies common to all. Touch but one of them, and the whole body took the alarm, as it actually came to pass in this instance. They dared not openly resist the emperor, but such powerful and well-directed efforts were exerted that the example which he intended to make was used as a weapon against himself, inasmuch as that each of these pretended adherents claimed the credit of having disarmed in anger, which had been greatly exaggerated for the purpose of setting a higher value upon the service he was rendering. But when it was a question of a man without any other protection than his personal courage, they were eager to press him down still lower than his case would have warranted, by which means they made a display of their zeal and gained an additional credit for themselves, which they reserved for the purpose of assisting their friends on another emergency. Those courtiers never presumed to speak candidly their sentiments. Their talents lay in an abject deportment, and in throwing doubts over the intentions of those who, although less servile in their conduct, were nevertheless more devoted to the emperor's service. The emperor only returned to St. Cloud on the 13th of August, 2 days before his festival, which occurred on the 15th. It was one of those solemn days of the year when all were seen flocking to the capital, either from their country houses or from the provinces, and relating to those around them what distance they had performed, in order to enjoy the satisfaction of presenting their homage to our august emperor, who had had the extreme condescension to inquire after the healths of themselves and their families. We return well contented, they said, since we have seen him in good health. May God preserve him for the happiness of all. Ah, sir, said one of the most ardent in his apparent zeal, I repeat it every day, what would become of us without him? I hold such a place. My brother has this one, my son has another. We can never discharge the debt of gratitude we owe him. This was always an annual song, every 15th of August, the anniversary of the emperor's birthday, and every 2nd of December, that of his coronation. The emperor listened to everything, though well aware to what extent he was to place reliance upon such professions. They meant no more than this: be always fortunate, rich and powerful, and you may rely upon the satisfaction which we shall always feel in accepting your bounty. Occasionally, however, he has trusted to the sincerity of many, and has acknowledged with feeling of evident regret that he had found himself disappointed. The 15th of August of this year was again passed in gaiety and amusements, because the affairs of Andalusia had not been made public, and no suspicion was entertained that our customary run of prosperity had received a check. It was only divulged some time afterwards, and it was truly curious to watch how the courtiers, whose trade is anything else but to fight, criticized those military men who had on that occasion clouded with cares that brow before which the courtiers were all so ready to bend the knee when they came to solicit a friendly smile, while their servility courted and treasured up when bestowed upon them. The emperor was not the dupe of this outward show. He allowed everyone the free range of his trade, without neglecting for a moment those affairs of high importance which called for his attention. When he had well considered the injurious consequences which he had to apprehend from the occurrence at Belen, he adopted a resolution worthy of his comprehensive mind. Chapter 30. The army was still in Prussia, where it was to remain and to be maintained until the contributions imposed on that country should be entirely paid. The emperor would willingly have allowed it to remain there longer, first because it was a convenient way of maintaining the troops, and secondly because the situation in which he stood was a trial of the sincerity of the sentiments which Emperor Alexander seemed to have sworn to him. His alliance with Russia might be founded only on necessity, and thence the presence of the army in Germany was its guarantee. But if the alliance was founded on a frank return to peace and a renunciation of every kind of enterprise, similar to those which had brought us into Germany in 1805 and 1806, he might without inconvenience transport this army into Spain. Such a measure could have created only feelings of security in Germany. The question for the emperor therefore stood thus: if I can leave my army in Germany, I shall not have war, but as I am obliged to withdraw it almost entirely, shall I for that reason have war? Now, said he, is the moment to try the stability of my work at Tilsit. He did me the honor to communicate to me his embarrassment, and I persisted in the opinion that the other powers sought only a favorable opportunity of again attempting his destruction. I added that if Russia did not take part in this attempt, it would be impracticable, but that, on the other hand, if that power should not agree with us respecting the Spanish enterprise, I had no doubt that the circumstance would be seized upon as a motive for coming to a rupture. The emperor seemed to feel no uneasiness in this point. He told me, however, that the affairs of Spain had engaged him farther than he had at first expected, but that would be easily explained. This last observation still further confirmed me in my opinion that the Emperor of Russia had been acquainted with the first project, and that it was only necessary to explain the difference between the first and the second. At the same time, I guessed the motive which had made us abandon the Turks. The Emperor said to me, on withdrawing the army from Prussia, I shall rapidly bring the affairs of Spain to a conclusion. But who will be my guarantee for Germany? We shall see. He had just received a courier from St. Petersburg. Some clouds had already gathered, but without telling me in what the difficulty consisted, he complained of the manner in which his affairs were conducted in Russia. Caulaincourt, said he, has raised up difficulties there instead of clearing them away. I know not why he has engaged in explanation on the subject of Poland, and allowed himself to make a proposition by which I should engage not to reestablish Poland. This idea carries its own absurdity along with it. How could I undertake to reestablish Poland when I have a war in Spain for which I am obliged to withdraw my army from Germany? This is too ridiculous. And if I cannot think of Poland, why make any question about it? I am not fate. I cannot foresee what is to happen. Is this question started because I am embarrassed? That, on the contrary, would be a reason for deferring it. Is there something here which I cannot explain? An interview is talked of in which I may be able to settle my affairs. and rather than run the risk of seeing them ruined, I would accede to the proposition. It would at least have the advantage of creating an imposing spectacle and affording me time to bring the Spanish business to a conclusion. Such was the emperor's state of mind. About the end of August 1808, it was very different from what it had been at the same period in the preceding year. I believe it was at this time that he directed his ambassador in Russia to fix with the Emperor Alexander the interview at Erfurt. It had been agreed upon at the Peace of Tilsit, but neither the time nor the place was determined. The whole of the month of September was spent in settling the day for the departure of the respective sovereigns from St. Petersburg and Paris, so that each might regulate his journey so as to arrive neither too soon nor too late. The Emperor Napoleon appointed the guards, provided the quarters, and defrayed the expenses of the tables, etc., not only for the Emperor of Russia, but also for the other sovereigns who attended the interview. Accordingly, a troop of cooks, stewards, and lackeys were sent from the department of the Grand Marshal. The company of the Théâtre Français also proceeded to Erfurt for the purpose of performing our best tragedies and comedies. Finally, nothing, however trifling, was neglected that could contribute to the amusement of the sovereigns during their stay at Erfurt. The emperor left Paris at the end of September, or beginning in October. He went straight to Metz, and on his way he inspected all the corps which were returning from the Grand Army to proceed to Spain. He stopped them on the road, and after examining them man by man, ordered them to continue their march. In this manner he proceeded to Frankfurt. The force which he had ordered to Spain was very considerable, for of all the vast army which was in Germany, he left behind only 4 divisions of infantry, with the cuirassiers, and a few regiments of light troops. That is to say, 1/4 of what there had previously been. The news of the interview at Erfurt excited great interest in Germany, and people thronged into the town from all parts. At the residence of the Prince Primate at Frankfurt, a vast number of German princes had assembled to pay their respects to the emperor as he passed through the city. He slept at the residence of the Prince Primate, and among the company present were the princes and princesses of Baden, Darmstadt, and Nassau. They treated the emperor with all the honor due to the protector of their confederation of the Rhine, and they seemed to vie with each other in showing testimonials of their respect and submission. The emperor left Frankfurt next day and proceeded straight to Erfurt. On his way, he met the king of Westphalia, who had come from Kassel to the frontiers of his state to receive him. Monsieur de Caulaincourt, the French ambassador in Russia, also came to meet the emperor, and he joined us between Erfurt and Gotha. He informed us that the Emperor of Russia was waiting at Weimar for the arrival of the Emperor Napoleon at Erfurt. We accordingly proceeded on speedily and arrived at Erfurt very early in the morning. Some troops had been brought into town, and the 1st Regiment of Hussars was stationed in several detachments between Erfurt and Weimar to render military honors to the Emperor Alexander. In conformity with the arrangements which had no doubt been made beforehand, the emperor mounted on horseback together with all who accompanied him. His retinue was followed by a horse for the Emperor of Russia, and the saddle which he was in the habit of using was even sent for him from Weimar. It had been brought from St. Petersburg expressly for this occasion. The emperor had advanced about 3 leagues from Erfurt when we descried the retinue of the Emperor Alexander, whose carriage was followed by 12 or 15 calashes. The Emperor Napoleon set off at a full gallop and alighted to embrace the Emperor of Russia. When he got out of his carriage, the meeting was as amicable and cordial as the sentiments which the sovereigns mutually cherished towards each other. They both mounted their horses and proceeded conversing together to Erfurt. The road was lined with the whole population of the surrounding country. The weather was delicious and seemed to smile auspiciously on the event. The sovereigns were saluted by the artillery from the ramparts. The troops formed a double line, and all the persons of distinction who had come from Erfurt on this occasion were assembled at the residence which had been prepared for the Emperor Alexander. At the moment when he alighted from his horse, accompanied by Emperor Napoleon, the 2 sovereigns dined together that day in company with The Grand Duke Constantine, who was his brother, the Grand Marshal had stationed a man in the street to watch and give information when the Emperor of Russia's carriage appeared in sight, and whenever Alexander visited the Emperor Napoleon, the latter was always stood at the feet of the staircase to receive his guests. The same ceremony was observed when the Emperor Napoleon visited the Emperor of Russia. While they remained at Erfurt, they always dined together, except on days when they had private business to transact at their respective residences. Soon after the arrival of the two emperors at Erfurt, they were followed by the kings of Saxony, Bavaria, Württemberg, and Westphalia, the Prince Primate, the Prince of the Anhalt, Coburg, Saxe, Weimar, Darmstadt, Baden, Nassau, and all who conceived it to be their duty to render homage to such an assemblage of power. The King of Russia did not come. He was represented by his brother, Prince William, who during a whole winter in Paris had endured the most painful situation in which a prince of his rank can possibly be placed, and whose conduct under these trying circumstances excited public interest and respect. He represented Prussia during the winter which followed the Treaty of Tilsit. The Emperor of Austria was not present at the interview. The measures which he had taken, the levies and requisitions of every kind he imposed on his states, had excited the remonstrances of France. His preparations were not finished. Protestations cost him little, and he resolved to make another attempt to deceive Napoleon. He sent General Vincent, who he knew was agreeable to the emperor, to deliver to him a letter in which he sought to remove the doubts which had arisen respecting the constancy of his sentiments. The hereditary princes of Mecklenburg, Savary, and Strelitz were also at Erfurt. The Emperor Napoleon had brought with him Monsieur de Champigny, the Minister for Foreign Affairs. He had besides Monsieur de Talleyrand and, as usual, Monsieur Marat and the Prince de Neuchâtel. General Oudinot had been sent as governor to Erfurt, and Marshal Soult, whose corps was proceeding to Spain, remained at Erfurt. All the time the emperor stayed there. His troops marched on before him, and he rejoined them at Bayonne. Several German princesses were also at Erfurt. Among them were the Princess of Baden, together with some of the different surrounding countries, the Princess of Tours and Taxis, and the Princess of Württemberg, born Coburg, etc. The mornings were invariably spent in visiting. Large dinner parties were formed, and dramatic representations were given in the evening. As the Emperor of Russia was known to be rather deaf, the company were arranged so that all the sovereigns sat near the orchestra. I recollect that during the performance of Oedipus, when the following passage occurred: "The friendship of a great man is a blessing of heaven." Alexander turned towards the Emperor Napoleon with the intention of applying this line to him. A murmur of approbation which ran through the company showed that the force and justice of the application was felt. In this agreeable manner, time slipped away almost imperceptibly at Erfurt. This year presented altogether a singular spectacle. In the month of January, the Emperor Napoleon was at Venice, surrounded by the homage of all the courts and princes of Italy. In April, he was at Bayonne, surrounded by the royal family and the most distinguished personages of Spain. And finally, in October, he was at Erfurt, in communication with the individuals above mentioned. The eyewitness of these events is unable to explain how it happened that such amicable meetings were not followed by a lasting peace. And with all possible respect for governments, it is impossible to refrain from attributing to them on this occasion a want of frankness and probity in the political transactions which they have signed for more than 20 years past, in the name of the interests of their subjects. There must have been a great duplicity, bad faith, want of courage, or voluntary ignorance, at least in the cabinets, or after so many interviews and so many thousand opportunities for explanation, mankind would not have been visited by new calamities for the sake of gratifying the self-love of some and the avidity of others. These are melancholy reflections, and it can no longer be said that if justice and probity were banished from among men, they would find refuge in the hearts of kings. Had England sent a minister to the meeting of Erfurt, the disputes of the world might have been brought to an arrangement. But the want of the concurrence of that power laid the groundwork of those terrible disasters, which subsequently ensued. The two emperors of France and Russia had respectively affairs to settle, of the importance of which it would be difficult to judge with sufficient accuracy to determine which of the two must have been most eager to accede to the interview at Erfurt. Russia was still engaged in the campaign which she had opened against the Swedes, whom she wished to deprive of Finland for the purpose of uniting it to her own dominions. It was even on his arrival at Erfurt that Alexander refused to ratify the armistice convened between his army in Finland and the Swedes. Russia had, moreover, her war in Turkey, which she wished to carry on vigorously, but in so doing she was going beyond what had been agreed on at Tilsit on this subject. The Emperor of Russia again proposed the division of the Turkish Empire, but the Emperor Napoleon evaded the question. After the conferences at Tilsit, he desired to have the personal opinion of General Sebastiani, his ambassador at Constantinople, respecting this proposition of the Emperor of Russia. General Sebastiani was entirely averse to the project, and in the long report which he submitted to the Emperor on his return from Constantinople, he demonstrated the necessity of France never consenting to the dismemberment of the Turkish Empire. The Emperor Napoleon had adopted that opinion. Russia had yet, I believe, to demand some little explanations respecting the future plans of which Poland might be the object. These questions were entirely in the interest of the Russians. Next came others which were in the interests of their allies, the Prussians. But the stipulations of the Treaty of Tilsit, of which the Emperor Alexander was the guarantee, Prussia had to pay considerable sums to France, and the French army was to remain in Prussia until the entire payment of these contributions. The King of Prussia, for the sake of obtaining peace, had submitted to any proposition, but after some time he remonstrated strongly against the payment of these exorbitant sums, and took advantage of the moment when the emperor was engaged in a new enterprise to endeavor to rid himself as far as possible of the contributions. The Emperor of Russia interested himself the more readily in this affair because the evacuation of Prussia was a stipulation of the Treaty of Tilsit, the execution of which had been deferred in proportion to the delay in the payment of the contributions, so that the King of Prussia was still at Königsberg when we were in possession of nearly all his states, though peace had been concluded above a year. The Emperor Napoleon had, on his part, great interest in bringing Russia to concur in the changes which he had effected in Europe since the Peace of Tilsit. He had made an arrangement with the Spanish government respecting Tuscany, which was held by the son of the Infanta of Parma, King of Etruria, and he had acquired claims to the succession of Charles IV, who disinherited his children. It was therefore necessary that he should come to an arrangement with the Emperor of Russia, lest that sovereign should offer any obstacle to a project which had already been adverted between them, but which had terminated differently from what was expected. In consequence of this same project, the Grand Duke of Berg had ascended the throne of Naples in lieu of King Joseph, who was called to the throne of Spain. These three questions which we had to arrange with the Russians were at least as important as those which the Russians could have settled with us. Such were the real objects of the interview at Erfurt, on which the tranquility of Europe depended. The two most powerful sovereigns in the world met on this occasion to settle their affairs, by which those of all other powers were to be determined. Though it is impossible to give a detailed report of all that passed between them, yet it may be supposed that as each of them traveled 300 or 400 leagues meetings for the purpose of making their arrangements. They reciprocally discussed every subject that would interest them and every enterprise in which they might wish to embark. Now it was absolutely necessary that they should mutually guarantee the continuance of peace, without which it would be impossible to carry their ulterior projects into execution. It cannot be supposed that the interview of Erfurt passed over without the consideration of every point which might appear doubtful in the policy of the two powers, as well as in the sentiments of the two sovereigns. It is then easy to guess what passed at Erfurt between the two sovereigns from what they mutually undertook after that conference. And we may also judge which of them failed in his engagements by the event which ensued and which would not otherwise have occurred, namely the war with Austria. Long arguments are not necessary to prove that. Had there existed the least shade of difference between the two sovereigns, the consequence would have been that the Russians would have suspended their Finland expedition and their war against the Turks, and would have prepared to meet the French army once more on the Niemen, in which case we should not have evacuated Prussia. On the part of France, the first consequence would have been to abandon her enterprise in Spain and to restore things as far as possible to the footing on which they were before any kind of derogation from the Treaty of Tilsit, by resuming the advantageous position we maintained previous to that period. But so far from anything like difference, such was the harmony between the two sovereigns, that they reciprocally acceded to each other's demands, and a wish being manifested on the part of France that the ambassador of Russia at Vienna should be substituted for the minister of that power at Paris, and Emperor Alexander readily assented to that arrangement. Accordingly, Prince Alexander Kurakin, who was the Russian ambassador at Vienna, received orders to proceed in the same character to Paris. The reason of the change was this: Count Tolstoy, the prince's predecessor, being more of a soldier than a diplomatist, recently engaged in discussions in Paris with other generals who were as little skilled in diplomacy as he, but like him, also good soldiers. The discussions were attended with some inconveniences for the generals with whom the Count conversed, repeated what was told to them by the Russian ambassador, and attributed to his words all the authority of an oracle. Not a single day during the conference at Erfurt was clouded by ill humor. The sovereigns were all attention to each other, and there was on every hand an appearance of perfect concord, which formed the subject of general congratulation. The Duke of Saxe-Weimar, whose son was married to a sister of the Emperor of Russia, and in whose territories the interview of Erfurt took place, gave a magnificent fête on the occasion. It commenced with a breakfast beneath a tent precisely similar to that which the Emperor had used on the eve of the Battle of Vienna. It was spread out in the same spot, and bivouac fires were kindled in the same places. The Duke of Weimar must have made very minute inquiries into all these particulars before he could have imitated them so perfectly. After breakfast, the company mounted on horseback and, conducted by the Duke, they followed the direction which was taken by the heads of our columns, whom they advanced to attack the Prussian line. After following all the movements of our army, the party arrived on the field where the battle was decided. Here a line of soldiers' huts was formed at certain intervals, where gamekeepers with guns were in waiting for those who wished to enjoy the amusement of shooting. As soon as the sovereigns had each taken their places, game snarers who were in concealment began to drive a vast quantity of game over to the huts, where it was shot by the company. Here was a battle of Vienna against the partridges. The shooting of birds was succeeded by a stag hunt, after which the party dined with the reigning Duke of Weimar. The Grand Marshal had sent to the Duke's residence the company of French actors who were at Erfurt, so that the amusements of the evening were complete. The fête terminated with the ball, which was kept up the whole of the night. Part 2, Chapter 1. While staying at Erfurt, the emperor received from General Junot an account of what occurred in Portugal, together with the treaty he had concluded with the English General Dalrymple for the evacuation of Portugal. The same courier brought news to the emperor from the Russian fleet under the orders of Admiral Siniavin, which General Junot had found at Lisbon on his arrival there. That admiral had also recently come to an arrangement with the English and consented to leave his fleet in England as a hostage until a peace should be concluded between Russia and that power. These details were communicated by the Emperor Napoleon to the Emperor Alexander without the slightest remark. The latter, however, expressed his disapprobation of the conduct of his admiral, but it was too late to repair the evil. The conferences at Erfurt were drawing to a close without having been interrupted by the least misunderstanding. I recollect our Minister for Foreign Affairs telling me one day in conversation that the emperor would only obtain what had been anteriorly agreed upon, as Russia was obstinately bent upon adhering to those bases. He said no more. I endeavored by turning his observation over in my mind to ascertain its precise meaning, and I think it could only relate to certain proposals of fresh arrangements, of which Prussia and Sicily in particular were the object. I am the more confirmed in this opinion for our having immediately afterwards evacuated that province, which measure was still wanting to give full effect to the Treaty of Tilsit. The emperor relaxed a little on the subject of contributions, and the Emperor of Russia expressed in my presence his entire satisfaction on this point. He had obtained everything he wished for, and had also concurred in whatever concerned the interests of the Emperor Napoleon. The Emperor of Russia sent a minister to reside at the court of the King of Naples, and ordered the one who had been in attendance near King Charles IV of Spain to resume his functions near King Joseph. Everything had therefore been conceded to the Emperor Napoleon's wishes. It only remained for him to place his brother upon the throne, and he was about to exert all the means in his power towards effecting this object. He quitted Germany upon the faith of the treaties he had signed, and thought he could rely upon the maintenance of peace, since his presence, or rather the presence of his troops, could no longer be complained of as a ground of perpetual uneasiness, orders having been given for withdrawing those troops and marching them into Spain. When everything had been concluded at Erfurt, and the sovereigns were about to separate, they determined first to make a joint effort for renewing, if possible, a negotiation with England. It was agreed that Count Romanzov, the Russian Minister for Foreign Affairs, should repair to Paris with full powers to follow up on the part of Russia any measures consequent upon the answer which was expected from the British government. On the eve of the Emperor Alexander's departure from Erfurt, the Emperor sent for me at night. He was in bed and wished to enter the conversation with me, as was his occasional practice at that hour. He first adverted to every other subject but the one he intended to dwell upon, and then asked me if I would willingly return to Russia. No, sire, I replied, for 2 reasons. The climate is dreadful, and if I were to return upon the same footing of favoritism on which I have already resided there during 6 months, I should fail to serve your interests, which require that the gravity of the ministerial character should at all times be upheld. Were I to act otherwise, I could only be the courtier of the Emperor Alexander, instead of being the ambassador to France. The Emperor clearly saw by my answer that I know his motives for proposing to send me back to Russia. He still urged his point, but I resisted, and notwithstanding a gentle reprimand, I stood my ground. I perceive, he said, that you were rather hurt at not having been the first ambassador appointed after the Peace of Tilsit. Rather so, your majesty, I good-humoredly replied, although I actually exerted my endeavors to be recalled from St. Petersburg. I felt anxious to know upon what footing I was to consider myself, and the appointment of Monsieur de Caulaincourt was the only reply I received. It would no longer be proper for me to succeed him, because I should run the risk of injuring your interests in attempting to follow any other line of conduct than that which he appears to have adopted. Do you then refuse to go? Said the emperor in reply to me. Sire, I answered, nothing can be farther from my wish than to be sent there. Should, however, your majesty command it, I am ready to obey. But I really think that the change would be injurious to your interests. I had been assured, rejoined the emperor, that you regretted Russia and would return there with pleasure. I had nothing more to add than that whatever could be most flattering to vanity or ambition had cheered my residence in Russia, that I relied much upon the favorable impression which I had left behind, but that unless he ordered it otherwise, I should prefer continuing my career in the army. If so, said the emperor, we will drop the subject. I secretly blamed myself for not accepting the embassy, feeling assured that I could avert serious misfortunes without any compromise of the dignity of either sovereign. Nothing more was required for upholding the good harmony between France and Russia. A pliancy of disposition should have been displayed by the ministry and by the ambassador, whose personal feelings ought to have merged in the object of keeping up a proper understanding between the two countries. This was to be done by nourishing the friendly intercourse of the two sovereigns, which had yet all the warmth of novelty. The sequel of these memoirs will unfold what actually came to pass. The moment of taking leave had now arrived. On each side, the separation was most amicable. The Emperor Alexander came to bid the emperor farewell. They had a long conversation together and parted for a moment to mount their horses. They left the town together and proceeded at a slow pace to a distance of 2 leagues, where the carriages of the Emperor Alexander were in waiting. The subject of their conversation has remained a secret, but they were no doubt very deeply engaged in it, since they never hurried their horses' pace, and their respective retinues purposely kept at a considerable distance behind. They at last came up with the carriages dismounted, walking together for a few moments, and took a farewell embrace of each other. I hastened up to the carriage and recommended myself to the favor of the Emperor Alexander, who embraced me, saying, "When I have once bestowed my esteem, I never alter." In the days of adversity, I replied upon this assurance and had cause to repent it. Such was the termination of the interview at Erfurt, which will be celebrated in the pages of history. It was calculated to secure the repose and happiness of the world, and yet it was only productive of misfortunes. The emperor returned to Erfurt at a slow pace, without uttering a word, and appearing lost in meditation. He had already given an audience of leave to all the sovereigns and foreign princes who were at Erfurt, and he took his departure the next morning for Paris, without making any stay on the road. Towards the end of October, we re-entered the French capital. Count Romanzoff, who followed us, reached Paris a few days after our arrival. He first alighted at a furnished hotel, but was soon invited by the emperor to take up his residence in the hotel of the Viceroy of Italy, where he sent servants and whatever was requisite for the representative of a great nation. Count Romanzoff gave several dinners in that hotel, and I had a conversation with him at one of them, which greatly increased my regret that, for the emperor's sake, I had not accepted the embassy to Russia in lieu of Monsieur de Caulaincourt. who was soliciting his recall. Count Romanzov addressed so many obliging expressions to me that, however little I may have been entitled to them, I could not feel otherwise than exceedingly flattered at the kind of opinion which the Emperor of Russia was pleased to entertain of me. In that conversation, he informed me of the approaching marriage of Her Serene Highness, the Grand Duchess Catherine, with the Prince of Oldenburg. I was very far from supposing that when he secretly confided to me this news, he would have any other object in view than my own gratification at hearing of so auspicious an event for a princess whom I greatly admired, and whom was always appeared to me calculated to grace one of the first thrones of the world, although I said no more than that I took a lively interest in the happiness which Her Majesty the Empress Mother would derive from a union she had been mainly instrumental in bringing about. I confess I was at a loss to understand why our ambassador did not throw obstacles in the way of that project, even without waiting for positive instructions to do so. What inconvenience could Europe have suffered by a Prince of Oldenburg remaining single for another year, more or less, whilst the bestowing hand of the Grand Duchess Catherine might have been a bond of eternal peace between two countries whose mutual harmony and reciprocal interest could never be too closely united? This object should have been the incessant aim of those within whose functions had arrangements necessarily fell. I must, however, do Monsieur de Caulaincourt the justice to say that the idea had occurred to him. I have read what he wrote on the subject to a third person in the hope that it would be communicated to the Emperor. But the surest way of defeating any plan he had in view was to mention it to another. The first inference which it was natural to draw from this was that such a communication on his part was only the result of an overture made to him, and respecting which he would have consented not to give a decisive explanation until after he should receive a reply to the letter I have just mentioned. I knew that the Emperor, who neither liked to be anticipated nor forestalled, nor yet to appear influenced by anyone, was greatly displeased at that letter, and Monsieur de Caulaincourt was doubtless not aware of the scene that had taken place with Monsieur Fouché the preceding winter, although it was natural for the Emperor to suppose him acquainted with it, and Monsieur de Caulaincourt's letter to this third person remained therefore unanswered. I leave it, however, to the judgment of any rational being to consider where the Emperor's inclinations would lead, whether on the side of a beautiful and amiable princess, possessing the advantages of an education seldom to be found even amongst the most celebrated female sovereigns, whose union would tend to cement an alliance of great advantage to her brother, for whom the Emperor Napoleon entertained a friendship which it was really easy to keep up, or on the side of a princess who was then unknown in France, whose very family connections were calculated to alarm all those who had had any share in the revolution, whose father, in short, had been 4 times in arms against us, often under circumstances which motives of policy alone could justify. True it is that when the latter princess arrived amongst us and her many personal accomplishments became known, the public agitation was allayed, and the loss of the former princess amply compensated. But this view of the question was wholly unconnected with what we might have accomplished in Russia by secretly opposing the marriage of the Grand Duchess Catherine. And since another union for the Grand Duchess had already occurred to the ambassador, he ought to have managed that, so that she should have been still disengaged. When in France, the choice of a princess became the subject of serious consideration, Count Romanzov remained in Paris until the arrival of the answer from London, which was nothing but a plain refusal. This was wholly natural to have been anticipated, since it was unreasonable to suppose that England would enter into any arrangement with France after the enterprise of the latter against Spain, when it had already refused the mediation of Russia after the Treaty of Tilsit. And it must be acknowledged that on both those occasions Russia acted with perfect candor, and was desirous of bringing about a general peace, quite as much, I am disposed to believe, though an impulse of philanthropic benevolence, as in order that France should disarm, and that she herself might return to her former commercial relations, the loss of which was of the most serious consequences to a country unable to flourish.